presentation looks at the literature surrounding the principles of effective feedback. It looks closely at that literature which focuses on feedback within a secondary school classroom. It has identified 6 core principles that teachers and school administration should take into account when establishing their feedback process. Principle 1. A positive student-teacher relationship supports the delivery of feedback and promotes greater opportunity for feedback to be utilised and appreciated by students. Feedback is seen as more beneficial when the relationship between student and teacher is not too authoritative, as has been seen in the past. This allows the feedback to be more readily seen as insightful and helpful by students. Face-to-face interactions also assist in producing a positive student-teacher relationship. These face-to-face interactions between teachers and students help to further stimulate the thinking of students and in turn impact upon the perceptions the students have about their teachers and their feedback. These face-to-face interactions have also been highlighted as important by Maclaren, who concentrated on an action research project within a secondary school that implemented an online learning program with students, whereby the teachers provided online feedback through a tool attached to the site. And it was undoubtedly seen through this project that teachers found that online feedback was in no way comparative to the face-to-face interactions, as these face-to-face interactions allowed misconceptions to be acted upon whilst they were being formed rather than post-task. A positive relationship should also, however, not cloud the truth feedback as found by other research. Positive relationships can have a tendency to be too motivationally focused and not learning based. And teachers need to be careful to balance their roles to ensure that they're meeting both the social and emotional needs, as are highlighted in these positive relationships, but also that they're meeting the academic needs of students. Principle 2, students should be provided with opportunities to acknowledge and demonstrate their understanding of the feedback provided. Feedback is limited and less effective when students are not provided with the opportunity to demonstrate their understanding of it. Previously, we discussed the Maclaren project using the online feedback tool. Additionally to this, students needed to acknowledge the feedback online using their tick-off system. And they also then needed to justify their next moves on the task based on the feedback that the teachers had just provided them. This encouraged greater reflective thinking and autonomy on the part of the learner, and additionally reassured teachers that their feedback had not gone unnoticed. Students view feedback without follow-up activities as useless. A study by Gamlin and Smith showed that even though students may have been supplied with a grade and comments post-assessment task, that without sufficient time to work on the feedback, whether this was during or post-task, students viewed these grades and comments as useless and ineffective. Insisting students justify their future steps on tasks post-feedback promotes reflective thinking and autonomy. We previously discussed this with regards to the work of Maclaren. Students also need to acknowledge their role in the feedback process and not wait for the teacher to identify misinterpretations. The responsibility must not lie with the teacher alone is a point that's raised in a lot of the literature. In particular, in a study by Plank, Dixon and Ward, the traditional role of a student was reversed and students were asked to present their teachers with feedback. And the students in this research indicated that they believed that the responsibility lay primarily with the students to admit their misunderstandings and confusions, and that it was up to them not to wait for teachers to recognise these misunderstandings in follow-up tasks. Students must be willing to own their own learning and be receptive in the feedback process, and then it is through these effective partnerships and positive partnerships that feedback becomes the essential link between learning and teaching. Principle 3, feedback should be personalised. Feedback dialogues allow the best opportunity for feedback to be personalised. Feedback within the classroom can occur in many forms. It could be written comments, grades, marks, oral responses, and body language or simply gestures. A feedback dialogue is a conversation that occurs between a teacher and a student. It's a face-to-face interaction, and it allows both the teacher and the student to respond to any misconceptions and discuss the task. Feedback dialogues allow for learning goals to be established and a plan explored for how students will fill the gaps of their learning with both input from the teacher and the student. Feedback dialogues may only engage students more in the process. In contrast to some of the previous research, study by Vanderschaaf, Bartman, Prince, Usman and Chubb showed that students who engaged in feedback dialogues with their teachers post-assessment definitely perceived the feedback as being more useful than students who had not engaged in a dialogue. But the feedback was not necessarily better in quality, nor was it necessarily more timely. It certainly engaged the students more in the feedback process. Dialogues need to be closely monitored, however. Dialogues in this particular research that was conducted showed that the dialogues seem to be dominated by teachers, which may hinder the true purpose of such conversation, which is to actively involve the students in the feedback process so that the feedback can be personalised and be as relevant as possible. Too much involvement on the part of the teacher may limit the student involvement in this discussion. Principle 4, students should receive feedback throughout the duration of a task. Students require teachers to be prepared to divert from their planned lessons in order to address the misconceptions of students, and this should not be sought only at the end of a lesson or unit of work. It's common practice for feedback to be given at the end of the class task or assessment. However, a study by Plank, Dixon and Ward uncovered that students have a desire for teachers to be aware of opportunities within a lesson to divert from what they had planned and address those misconceptions as they arise. When they're given in the last moments of a lesson, students viewed this as a non-serious attempt at assessing whether or not the material had been understood. This also highlights the necessity for timely feedback and the critical role it plays in learning. The focus of feedback shifts if it is simply at the end of a task. We previously discussed how effective feedback dialogues can be in the feedback process. These should also occur mid-task. This is related to the research by Vanderschaaf. If they only occur post-task, there's a concern that the focus shifts to addressing the presentation of the task and the way in which the skills are communicated, rather than focusing on the skills that have actually been retained or the knowledge that has been retained during the task. Too much feedback during the task phase may focus a student's attention on short-term goals, and too much scaffolded feedback is less inclined to encourage students to focus on their long-term learning goals that they have. However, any feedback is better than no feedback, as found in a study by Butler, Godbole and Marsh, and that although it is ideal to provide feedback throughout the task or quickly after the completion of the task, providing any explanatory feedback to a student regarding a task, regardless of the time that may have passed, is beneficial. Principle 5, teachers should specify what needs to be done to improve a task. Feedback must be more than comments or a grade at the end of the task. It should instruct students as to how they may improve upon their work and possibly provide exemplar responses. Process-oriented feedback details positives and negatives of a task and gives the student direction. The process-oriented feedback is an approach to feedback. It's standards-based and makes reference to specific tasks and discusses the strengths and the weaknesses of a task, and directs the students as to where they should go to ensure they attain their long-term learning goal. It's a whole school approach to feedback in that it would be used by every faculty and students would become familiar with that approach. It can also be used alongside traditional feedback such as grades. Positive feedback was viewed by students as feedback which gave an indication as to how the task could be improved. Students also found feedback with grades but no comments as useless and reflected only the effort a student may have put in rather than the quality. So feedback without comments runs the risk of being interpreted as marks purely based on the effort and engagement of the student and not related directly to the quality of work the student had produced. Students have become accustomed to a particular grade system. This was found in a study by Smith and Gorard where a school eliminated the use of grades completely. And that they found when they did this that the students that received comments without a grade were disappointed and found it difficult to truly determine their performance. Albeit in this study, it seemed that the teachers had merely removed the marks from the assessment and hadn't altered their comments. So students were receiving comments such as incorrect or very good. And they found that these comments were very difficult to work with and really establish how they had gone. This highlights that the quality of comments is critical in the assessment, in the feedback process. Feedback as comments increases a student's ability to apply their knowledge to new contexts. So in contrast to some of the other research, Butler, Godbole and Marsh found that there seemed to be no difference between the results of students who had received grades only to those that may have received grades and comments after they had retaken an identical test. However, the research does show that in follow-up tasks, so after the retaking of this test, students that had received comments were better able to apply their knowledge to new contexts and use their feedback to extend their understanding rather in opposition to those who had only received grades. One important thing to also consider in this process is other stakeholders. An interesting point that Smith and Gorard found within their study is that students expressed concern that when they received comments but no grade for a task, they had difficulty showing or articulating the progress of their learning to their parents, who were no doubt used to a previous grading system. Principle 6, clear communication of marking criteria, rubrics and standards is paramount. Teachers should be clear in their task expectations and make links to them in their own feedback. In the data collected by Havner, Smith, Disney and Ludvigstein, this data showed a significant difference between how students perceived the feedback provided by the teachers compared to how the teachers viewed their own feedback. And it was concluded from this study that teachers therefore needed to be more explicit in their feedback practices and be clearer in the explanation of what the task requirements are before a task and what they were when providing feedback, so the students can see that crucial link. And that teachers should also provide the students with options to show how they may improve their work. The language of standards and criteria can often be difficult for students to understand and teachers to understand. In a study by Dargush, it was reported that teachers were hesitant to utilise standards and assessment criteria within their own classroom practices because they found this language difficult to comprehend. And that teachers were indeed using grades as an additional piece of feedback for students because of this lack of understanding. It was then clear from this research that teachers needed to view the explanation of rubrics and marking criteria as essential in the assessment process for both teachers and students. Standards do not always recognise the complexities of teaching. This is a cautionary word from the Dargush study. It's recommended that teachers supply their students with a series of standards and marking criteria through which the students' work will be marked so that the students develop those necessary goals of self-evaluation where they can look at the standards and rubrics and align their work accordingly. However, teachers should not rely wholly on these as feedback, as standards alone do not reflect the complexities of teaching and may limit the feedback that the students have access to. An assessment culture within a school should be established. This is a general theme that overarches this particular principle. It was found in this study that the schools that were involved lacked an overall assessment culture, and that this hindered the overall reception of feedback by students, as they truly viewed the feedback as purely a teacher role and responsibility. An assessment culture would include the participation of school leadership, teachers and students in the development of goals, the setting of criteria for tasks, and system of feedback between students and staff where the roles and responsibilities are acknowledged and accepted by all. This concludes the presentation relating to the literature surrounding the principles of effective feedback.